buildings embody ideas. They speak to the nature of civilization, for better or for worse. And I also came to see how architecture is the most political of the arts, small p political. I mean, Washington, D.C., obviously, as the nation's capital, is incredibly important symbolically. The art and architecture has a huge influence on how Americans think of our country and think of themselves, in that it's public. It's forced upon us in a way that a painting is not, or a novel is not. Everyone is forced to experience architecture on a daily basis, and it can either make your day better or it can make your day worse.
Howdy, everyone. Welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this is sort of the season finale of season 4 of Moment of Truth. Thank you guys, as always, for listening. We have a very interesting, long overdue episode for today. But before I get to that, be sure, as always, to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything we have cooking as an organization. Things are going to be changing a lot in the new year, hopefully. So be sure to keep up with everything that we are doing over there. You can find the backlog of this show. I think it's like well over 170 episodes, hundreds of hours of content. I feel like I've either done this podcast for like 2 episodes or 2,000. It's all blended together at this point. And you can also sign up for our programs, whether it's our lunches on Capitol Hill, AM Fridays, our Fellowship for American Statecraft, where we pay kids $3,000 a month for 3 months to get their first job here in Washington, D.C., Frontiers of American Statecraft, foundations, and much, much, much more. If you want to get involved here in D.C., you can also just go to AmericanMoment.org/join, fill out that form, and we will meet with you to figure out how to do that. Today, I had on Justin Shubow, who is the president of the National Civic Arts Society, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. that advances the classical tradition in public art and architecture. He serves as executive director of Rebuild Penn Station, a National Civic Arts Society initiative to promote the reconstruction of the original Pennsylvania station in New York. He is a member of the board of academic advisors for the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization and on the board of advisors of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. He was, until Joe Brandon kicked him off, also the member and eventually the chairman of the Commission of Fine Arts, the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, which was established by Congress on 17th of May, 1910, in order to oversee, all things art and architecture here in the United States. He's got a really fascinating story of engaging in a practical way on these issues. I'm generally not a fan of thumbsucky intellectuals, which is why I like Justin. He can wax poetic about the baleful Hegelian influence on our art and architecture, but he also wrote a 150-page report about all the ways the Eisenhower Memorial, as proposed, was wrong, and actually got it changed and moved in a significantly better direction. And he goes through that story here. He's a really, really smart guy, someone who I hope has enormous influence in the years to come over the direction that America's public policy towards art and architecture will go. I mean, he's basically the only game in town, so I don't know who else people can go to. There's not that many people we have that know how to speak eloquently and intelligently on this topic. It was a lot of fun. Part of the reason that this episode was delayed, and I don't know if he's going to get mad at me for saying this, is because probably about two and a half years ago, I ran into Justin. We had this amazing conversation at one of these dorky conservative conferences. And I said, "Hey, you should come on our podcast." And he kind of looked at me po-faced and he made a joke. He was like, "Ah, yes, a podcast, a perfect medium to talk about art." And I was like, well, crap, that's a good point. But as you will soon find out, we actually had a fantastic discussion about art and architecture. You can discuss a visual media in what, at least for most of our listeners, is a purely audio product, although the full experience, especially our beautiful mugs, can be had through the public display. We'll go now to Justin Shubow for a great discussion on all things art and architecture. Justin, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
We always love to hear about how our guests got to where they are today. You might have an especially interesting story, because how does one end up being the foremost, advocate for beautiful buildings in America is, I think, an interesting tale. Tell us that story. How did you get involved in all this?
Well, I do have a very early memory of going to a brutalist public library near where I grew up and just hating it.
Where was that?
That's in Towson, Maryland.
Okay.
In fact, I recently went by it just to see, is it what I remembered it was. And it's interesting. They painted the exterior some bright colors to try to cheer it up. But yeah, it's just a hideous public.
Yeah. So in the CBS documentary about, the making of a supervillain one day, like that'll be your origin story is, that place.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. I was abused as a child by this building.
Yeah. Okay. So that's your earliest memory.
And in fourth grade, I did say that I wanted to be an architect when I grew up. So I even knew what architecture was. I had a cousin who, we drove around Washington, D.C., and he was pointing out the columns, like that's Corinthian, that's Ionic, that's Doric. And it did start opening my eyes. But really, my interest in architecture developed much later when I was getting a PhD in philosophy. And I started reading philosophers writing about architecture, how buildings embody ideas, especially Roger Scruton, the great British philosopher. People know him for his conservative political philosophy, but his first and foremost interest was aesthetics. That's what he wrote his PhD on, and he was, in my view, the greatest philosopher of architecture of his time. So I read him and other people, and I came to see how buildings embody ideas. They speak to the nature of civilization, for better or for worse. And I also came to see how architecture is the most political of the arts, small p political, in that it's public. It's forced upon us in a way that a painting is not or a novel is not. Everyone is forced to experience architecture on a daily basis, and it can either make your day better or it can make your day worse. And I was of the opinion that architecture had, by and large, gotten much worse since World War II. And I came to start reading more widely about, why is that the case? I had my intuitions, but I didn't necessarily know the history. But I read books like Tom Wolfe's From Bauhaus to Our House, which helped to justify my intuitions and make me feel like I wasn't alone. Ultimately, I came to Washington, D.C. for work and joined the board of directors for the National Civic Art Society, which is a nonprofit that advocates for the classical tradition in public art and architecture. It was founded in 2002, and I joined the board in 2011. At the time, it had no staff, but it was a very exciting organization. And obviously, I joined it. People had recommended me for it, given my interest. And I had a day job at the time, but while I quickly became the head of the National Civic Art Society, and we launched a fight to stop the proposed design for the National Eisenhower Memorial here in D.C. The selected architect was Frank Gehry, one of the world's most famous architects, a starchitect, known for doing some kind of wild and chaotic designs.
Sorry, star architect.
Right, but it's usually used as a derogatory term. People
like Michael Bay as a film director, as starchitect.
At that level. No, I don't think any architect would ever call him or herself a starchitect.
Okay,
but their detractors often do, and it's representative of their star power.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who have architects who have celebrity. I think if you ask people to name a living architect, if they can name one, they'll name Frank Gehry.
Mm.
And Gary's design, or his proposed design, was gargantuan, 4 acres, so big that you could fit the Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, and Washington Monument inside of it.
Where was it going to be?
Well, sad story. It did ultimately get constructed, but in a much improved version, in my view, thanks to our and others' efforts. But it is just south of the Air and Space Museum, essentially across the street from the National Mall in front of the Department of Education. The main feature of his proposed design was this giant so-called tapestry made of steel. Really, it's sort of a scrim or a fence.
Mm-hmm.
And the sole statue of Eisenhower was going to portray him as a life-size barefoot boy seated on a plank, like a 7-year-old Tom Sawyer image. And I wrote a 150-page report laying out everything wrong with the memorial, everything from the competition, which was a closed competition. There were only 44 entrants. And it seemed like the fix was in for Gary from the very beginning. The problems with the competition, with the federal approval process, to the design itself. I mean, the Eisenhower family came out in full force against the design, and the whole thing just exploded.
And were they not looped into the process originally?
Well, they sort of were and sort of weren't. Eisenhower's grandson was on the commission overseeing the creation of the memorial, but when the controversy exploded, he resigned, and his sister, Susan, became the public face for the Eisenhower family when it came to opposing the design. And the controversy got so big that Congress upheld all funding for the memorial for 4 years, and there was a bill to reboot it with a new competition. I testified in the House in favor of that bill.
When was this?
The controversy really, I published my report in January of 2012.
Okay.
And
and who had stacked the commission and the process originally? When was that all?
Well, I don't remember the exact year. The commission had been around for a while before they even finally got around to having a competition.
The reason I ask is because, like, is this the kind of thing that happened under everyone's noses during a Republican administration or a Democratic one? Like, because it feels like until relatively recently, this is the kind of thing that could have totally happened.
Well, it was a bipartisan commission. Yeah. You know, there were Republicans and Democrats from the House and Senate on it, as well as presidential appointees. So I wouldn't say it was a political thing. The memorial was flying under the radar. They were hoping it was just gonna, be a fait accompli. One day people wake up and shovels are in the ground. But I was able to do research and really expose what the design was going to look like. So, and also thanks to our efforts, not only did the Barefoot Boy get removed, but 2 giant pieces of the memorial, in addition to that main tapestry, orthogonal to it, were 2 other tapestries, each bigger than a basketball court. And those got removed. They would have blocked the view to and from the Capitol. And we're proud to say that at least those improvements were made. Sadly, at the very end, Jim Baker was brought in to broker a backroom deal. And he met with the Eisenhower family. I'm not even sure Frank Gehry was involved. And, he said, well, what if the tapestry features, an image of Normandy as opposed to originally it was supposed to be Kansas? And the deal was done. The Eisenhower family caved. And as a result, Congress stopped opposing it and the design got built. It was literally designed by committee. So that ultimately was a sad story. But I think it has had some really great repercussions. First and foremost, the organizers of the new National World War I Memorial saw the mistakes that the Eisenhower people made. And the vice chairman of the Centennial Commission building that memorial, Edwin Fountain, is a great guy, real rock solid, old-fashioned guy who wanted something that was, much more fitting for its subject matter. And he made sure to have an open competition. And I mean, I do know Edwin, and I spoke with him and told him that any competition is only as good as the brief and the jury. And I said the brief
meaning
the
like
brief
RFP.
Meaning what you're supposed to put in the competition. So by contrast, the Eisenhower Commission competition was not a design competition. It was just a portfolio-based competition.
Okay.
Even though the history of modern memorials in Washington, D.C. has been through open design competitions. I said the brief...
What else went through that process?
Yeah. Well, the most famous example is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. That had over 1,000 entries, and the competition was blindly reviewed and was won by Maya Lin, who was a Chinese American undergraduate at Yale at the time. So it was a way of discovering talent. No fix was in for the Starchitect of its time.
Yeah.
But the I told Edwin that the brief has to specify that the memorial design shall evoke valor and heroism, because ever since the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, there's been a real hesitance to do war memorials or even almost any memorials that are heroic. We've seen so many victim memorials, but by contrast,
and who are the is it something that Code Pink gets all agitated about? Like, who are the interest groups that like push on that kind of thing?
I don't know if there's any particular interest group, but it's the general outlook of the art and architecture establishment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when was the last time you went to a contemporary art museum and saw patriotic artwork?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to think of it. And I mean, to give a case in point of just how bad this can be, if you go to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where they have the United Flight 93 Memorial, commemorating the plane that went down on September 11. As you know, the passengers stormed the cockpit, and yes, the plane crashed, but they saved a core building of government. Yeah. It's like what they did is up there with Paul Revere's ride and its significance in American history. Ordinary Americans fighting terrorists and essentially winning. There is nothing in the memorial in Pennsylvania commemorating the heroism of the passengers on that flight. You could imagine an inscription saying, "Let's roll." I mean, you could even imagine some men standing behind what is that cart called? A beverage cart. I mean, you could do it, right? A really good sculptor could do it. And I went to a public talk by the designers of that memorial, and I asked them, how come none of that is in there? And then he told me, well, we didn't want to do anything controversial. So that's an outlook that I think is shared by a lot of the art establishment. By contrast, the competition for the World War I Memorial, the final winning design has this incredible heroic sculpture by Sabin Howard, who has said about his design, which recently just opened in Washington, there are no victims here, everyone's a hero. Now, that's not to say that there isn't tragedy and suffering in the design, but at the same time, you see soldiers, bravely marching as comrades in arms, entering the crucible of battle, holding rifles with bayonets, screaming. It's really powerful. And then, then you see the wreckage of the battlefield, which includes a twisted cross or a broken cross, a wounded or dead soldier being held by a nurse, and you see a shell-shocked soldier. But what do you see at the end of the memorial is a victory parade with the American flag. And then at the final image, you see a soldier returning home, handing his helmet to his daughter, who is all grown up. Because at the very beginning of the memorial, which should be read from left to right, it's cinematic. It's telling a story of a single soldier. In fact, it's called a soldier's journey. At the beginning, he's leaving home with his daughter young, and at the end, she's all grown up. And he's essentially handing her World War II. But the memorial demonstrates America on the rise. We are now a world power. And it's hard to imagine, nothing like this has been built in America for a very long time. And the sculptor has said he hopes that this is the beginning of a new American cultural renaissance.
There's so much that's interesting there. I mean, would you say it's accurate that the excellence of that product was largely contingent on the variation in process, or was the commission stacked with more patriotically minded
it was
people?
First and foremost the leadership of Edwin Fountain.
Okay.
Some of the leadership of the Eisenhower Commission, they didn't have their eye on the ball. Yeah. I mean, well, the chairman of the original chairman actually is friends with Frank Gehry. And he said at the first meeting of the Eisenhower Commission, long before there was even a competition, we should get someone like Frank Gehry to design the memorial. So I guess he did have a vision. Yeah. It was just a bad one.
Just give it to my buddy.
In this case, Edwin, to give you a sense of where he's coming from, he told me he originally wanted the memorial to include an inscription from the officer who famously said before the troops, leaped out of the trench, come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever? And I said, Edmund, you can't put that in a national memorial. But that gives you the perspective of who we're talking about here. And the result is magnificent. And I'm hoping, will change the direction of commemorative works in this country.
So would it be accurate to say the Eisenhower Memorial fight put you guys on the map as an organization?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, the report I wrote was picked up by a lot of pundits, especially a lot of conservative writers. I mean, it was quoted by members of Congress. It just, it really did put us on the map. And I should also say, just regarding the World War I memorial, that just so happens that the sculptor Sabin Howard is a friend of mine, and I did encourage him to enter the competition.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. What have been the following flashpoints that you guys have been involved in as an organization where there's been an opportunity to sort of change the direction that these projects might go?
Sure. So during Trump's administration, attention was paid to something called the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, which is the aesthetic review board for Washington, D.C. It's made up of 7 members who are appointed by the president. It was established in 1910 and is the aesthetic guardian for Washington, D.C. It looks at the design of all monuments, memorials, public buildings, and over the decades, it has approved everything that we see in Washington, good or bad. Starting around the time of World War II, the commission almost became entirely modernist in orientation. Under President Trump, I was his first appointment. Commissioners are appointed to 4-year terms, and historically, the terms run out, and as they roll off, they're replaced. So I was his first appointee. Obviously, I'm a very strong supporter of classicism. Ultimately, as the other commissioners' terms rolled off, they were all replaced by strong supporters of classical art and architecture. So it represented a complete takeover of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. And I think that was a really incredible moment in, the culture of our country. I mean, Washington, D.C., obviously, as the nation's capital, is incredibly important symbolically. The art and architecture has a huge influence on how Americans think of our country and think of themselves. And it can be done well or it could be done badly. And President Trump, to his credit, was paying attention to this commission when numerous presidents prior to him had not been paying attention whatsoever. Now, sadly, after President Biden was elected, just a few months later, he removed me and 3 other commissioners from the commission.
On what grounds?
Well, the White House told the press that our strong support for classical architecture did not comport with the president's values. As you can imagine, the art and architecture establishment could not abide by the fact that the Fine Arts Commission was all traditional in orientation. Also, to provide more of the context, and I should say that no commissioner had been removed by the president in the commission's 110-year history. So there was real...
But President Trump's the one who violates norms.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And let alone removing the chairman, because I was ultimately elected chairman of the commission, and typically chairmen serve longer than 4 years to get renewed. I mean, I was only the 11th chairman in the commission's 110-year history. But as for the broader context, when Trump was president, he issued an amazing executive order that reoriented federal architecture, which had been almost entirely modernist since World War II, in a classical and traditional direction. So the federal government obviously builds lots of, courthouses and office buildings across the country. And for decades, they've been hideous or dismal or dispiriting. I mean, you can think of all sorts of brutalist buildings in Washington, D.C., like the FBI headquarters or the HUD headquarters. These were all the responsibility of the federal government. And President Trump saw that these buildings are widely disliked by the American people, and they have the exact wrong symbolism. I mean, to me, a brutalist building is the equivalent of a boot stomping on your face for all eternity.
Yeah.
And then in more recent years, we have some kind of crazy avant-garde designs. Perhaps the worst of the worst is the San Francisco Federal Building, designed by an architect named Tom Main. It looks like an alien spacecraft that's about to shoot laser beams at you. And there are some other, avant-garde designs out there. And it's just...
What about like the African American History Museum here in DC?
Well, that's separate. The Smithsonian buildings are managed under a different system than federal buildings. But there are some other egregious buildings. Another one being the Salt Lake City Federal Courthouse, which looks like a board cube. And there have been very few classical or traditional designs, very few courthouses that look like courthouses. And President Trump understood this, perhaps because he is a builder and understands what is popular with the ordinary person, because
gold.
Well, Costco could tell you that. Yeah. But, we did a survey, my organization did a survey by the Harris Poll in 2020, which found that 72% of Americans preferred classical and traditional architecture for federal buildings and U.S. courthouses. I don't think that result
How's that
surprising.
Question worded? Like you said, classical and traditional?
No. So what we did is we had pairs of actually existing buildings that were carefully selected for shape, color, size, and so on. So it was a real apples to apples comparison. One of the buildings being traditional and one of them being modernist. And they were photoshopped so that the sky was similar. Everything was kept. All the variables were controlled. So it was just a focus on the buildings.
The lefty architects would endorse the examples that you put out there.
Like we did not cherry pick quote unquote bad examples of modernist architecture. Yeah. There were buildings in there by famous name architects.
Yeah.
Architects. Or some of them architects, like people like Marcel Breuer. Yeah. Like I think the HHS headquarters was in there, for instance. And we were not cherry picking. So it was a visual preference survey. And the question was, which of these buildings would you prefer for a federal building or U.S. courthouse?
Yeah.
And like I said, the results were 72% favoring tradition, but there were also widespread majorities across all demographic groups, gender, race, socioeconomic, and also political party affiliation, with 73% of Republicans preferring tradition and 70% of Democrats.
Wow. It's a statistically insignificant difference. Yeah.
Right. And I think for most people, this is not a surprising result. Ordinary people stubbornly prefer tradition in their buildings.
Yeah.
It's in contrast to the architectural elite, which is largely modernist in orientation. And so this, I like to say you don't have to be a populist to favor having more classical and traditional public buildings. You just have to be a popularist.
Yeah. So why does the left like these strange and ugly styles of buildings?
Well, I don't know if I can talk about the left as a whole, but there are certain people who say that classical architecture is the architecture of white supremacy. This is the architecture of Western civilization. This is the architecture of those courthouses in the South that upheld segregation. They'll make arguments like that, though ignoring that segregation was militated against in federal courthouses that were also classical. And, our survey showed that, African Americans also, a majority of African Americans like classical and traditional design. They don't seem to think it's racist. I mean, you'll also find the left arguing that classical architecture is fascist, the term that we hear nowadays. or Hitler liked it, so therefore anyone who likes classical architecture, I guess, is also a Nazi. Ironically, when the executive order was leaked some months before it was ultimately issued, the New Republic magazine, which is a liberal magazine, first ran an article, connecting classical architecture to reactionary politics and so on. But they did later run an article called "The Non-Fascist Case for Classical Architecture." So it was a relief.
That was a big win. Put that guy on your board.
It was a relief to know that one could like classical architecture without being a fascist. I think more broadly, part of the issue is that traditional architecture is looking to the past fondly. It's a way of saying some of the things we did previously are good and should be continued. But for certain people on the left, if you have a utopian ideology, you want to reject the past and build an entirely new future. I mean, you could even say that certain kinds of, leftist utopians have a nostalgia for the future. And you see, if you look at the history of architecture, how modernism arose after World War I in Europe in this ferment of revolutionary politics, both on the far left and the far right. If you look at the leading architects of the time, they were Nazis or socialists or going back and forth between them. But what they did often have in common was an optimism about the mass of men in opposition to the individual. There were all these manifestos written at the time. One called for the death of the soul, another one called for the dictatorship of the machine. And in modernist architecture, especially of that time period, you do see this machine ethic. You do see the embodiment of an ethos of mass production. And for certain people, that's a plus, not a minus. And then later, you do get modernist styles like brutalism essentially becoming the architecture of public housing, of great society, of socialist planning in Britain. And it's what I think people think of when they think of Soviet architecture. So the HUD building in Washington, which was completed, I think, in the 1960s, is an example of a brutalist building. Julian Castro, the head of HUD, who was appointed by a Democrat, but just so happens to be a Cuban American, he said that the building looked like something from the Soviet Union. And he did not like it. And so I think, again, he represents more of the ordinary American's perspective on architecture.
Yeah. What do you make of the argument? And so just to put my own cards on the table here, I know nothing about this stuff other than random things I pick up on Twitter and from friends. And so if I misuse jargon, vocabulary, or even completely misunderstand a concept, reprimand me. But it's my understanding that what we consider classical American architecture, what a lot of the older buildings in DC are built around, was itself at the time considered like a pastiche combination of a bunch of different European styles, sort of gauche, like that someone even then would have talked about that style when it was first being implemented, the way you might be talking about these new styles. Is that true?
No, I don't think that's. Okay. I don't think that's true at all.
Okay.
So we haven't talked about it, but the founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were both amateur architects. Mm-hmm. And Jefferson
designed Monticello himself, right?
He designed Monticello. He designed the Virginia Capitol, mm-hmm. arguably the first important public building in the United States, which is based on a classical temple. Mm-hmm. It's actually very closely modeled on an ancient Roman temple in France, in Nîmes. Jefferson was arguably an architectural genius. And in the Virginia Capitol and in Monticello, he was looking to the past. He was looking to the ancient world. And then in Monticello, looking to the Renaissance, and was really ahead of his time. His classicism, in some ways, is antecedent to the rise of neoclassicism in Europe. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, he was the avant-garde. And, Jefferson looked back to the classical tradition, seeing it as time-honored and timeless. He talked about it as having the approbation of thousands of years. And he and George Washington also looked back to, the precedents from ancient Greece and Rome, Greek democracy and Republican Rome. These are some
two very distinct traditions, right? And so
yes, well, but the Roman tradition evolved out of the Greek tradition. Sure. And I mean, both in terms of political philosophy and in terms of architecture. So I would not say that, what the founders were doing or the design of the U.S. Capitol is pastiche in any way. I mean, if you look at the U.S. Capitol, I think it's unmistakably an American building. No one, you're not going to think, oh, that's a French building or that's a German building. It has an American flavor. And the founders inaugurated a classical idiom that remained the norm for federal architecture for 150 years. And in fact, the vast majority of state Capitol buildings are also based on the U.S. Capitol, with the dome that we might take for granted. But that's a very American form, as the way the Capitol is designed. Now later, around the turn of the 19th century, you get the rise of what's called Beaux-Arts architecture. An example of that would be later, the design of the U.S. Supreme Court, the Jefferson Memorial. It originally came out of it was influenced by French design, but again, I think that great American architects took that and made it their own. I mean, again, you look at the Supreme Court building, which is a building that was completed in the quote unquote modern era. That building's from the 1930s. It's not from 1800. They took the classical tradition and made it uniquely American. So again, I would not call that pastiche whatsoever. And there is classicism alive and well today. A rare example of a new classical federal building is the courthouse in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It's a Greek revival design with fluted columns. It's beautiful, has a pediment, and it's been very popular with both the people of Alabama as well as the judges and the courthouse workers. The only reason that building exists in that form is because Alabama Senator Shelby fought for it. He was chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee and was able to force the General Services Administration, the agency responsible for federal buildings, to give him a classical design. GSA, by contrast, wanted originally to build a steel and glass box. And he said, over my dead body. But even he had to fight GSA to get it done.
This is a complete tangent, but is there any weird common cause to be potentially had with like the climate change people on some of this stuff? Because the steel and glass boxes are really hard to cool. They're very energy intensive, right?
Yeah, you make a great point.
Yeah.
Classical and traditional architecture is more sustainable.
Yeah, it's more temperature regulating. Because that's what it's built for, right?
The a masonry wall has better insulation qualities than a glass wall. And it also can last hundreds, if not thousands of years. I mean, the Capitol building is 200 years old, but it's still fully functional building. By contrast, say, look at the FBI headquarters, which was completed in the 1970s, a concrete brutalist design. It's falling down. It's so decrepit that it has to be torn down. And that's at a huge cost, hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's also at a huge environmental cost. All of that concrete has to go somewhere. And building waste represents a huge percentage of all waste in the United States. Classical and traditional building techniques are greener. And another argument is that, the greenest building is one that doesn't get torn down because building waste is terrible. And takes a lot of energy to construct a building. It's what's called embodied energy. It's not just the energy in terms of the use of the building, but, creating,
concrete is very carbon intensive.
Right. By contrast, cutting stone is not. And a building that does not get torn down, and guess what? The buildings that are beloved, by and large, do not get torn down, are more green, more environmentally friendly.
Very interesting. Going back to the sort of critiques of this of the classical tradition, how do you conceive of something like the Art Deco movement inside your view of the world? Because I think there's a lot of people that would look at that as a positive direction that American design and architecture were potentially going in. Tell me your thoughts on it.
I think that Art Deco was the last of the classical styles.
Okay. So you see it as part of that tradition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All the ornament, the decoration. I mean, you look at a building like the Chrysler Building. I mean, a masterpiece of Art Deco. I mean, it has sort of giant hood ornaments on it. The lobby is also spectacular, not just the top of it. That is absolutely a classical building.
Okay.
And in fact, President Trump's executive order in its definition of classical included Art Deco. It was very broadly defined, everything from neoclassical to Beaux-Arts to Art Deco. So I would love to see a resurgence of Art Deco, and perhaps leading the way is Elon Musk.
Yeah.
As you may know, Musk has said if his companies have an aesthetic, it is Art Deco.
Yeah. Which, like, I do think that you use nostalgia for the future as a pejorative earlier, and I was like, that sounds pretty good, actually. Art Deco might be like where those things can combine, is like that classical futurism, if such a thing can exist.
Sure. I mean, Art Deco incorporated modern technology, modern techniques. And so you might say it's a way of softening the edge of technology. Yes, we can be proud of trains and cars and electricity, but it doesn't have to be that we're living in a technopoly where technology controls us. We control technology.
Yeah. Maybe this is inside your wheelhouse, maybe it's not, but I am curious how this stuff cascades down into the way the world around us looks. Obviously, DC is one of the most constrained cities in the country in terms of what you're allowed to build and how. But just talk me through like the kind of chain of causality where, you know, the nature of how our federal architecture is constructed and the design principles that go into it might end up having an impact on how a normal two-story suburban home is built. I mean, how do you, presumably, you know, the federal buildings are something that are closest to potential political control. And so it's a good place to focus attention, but I don't want just the federal buildings to look good. I want all the buildings to look good. So how do you think about?
Well, changing the direction of architecture as a whole is a big challenge, but certainly important buildings can shape people's imaginations and shape their desires. And architects and architecture schools will respond to patronage. I mean, the government spends a lot of money on buildings.
It's probably the biggest customer, right?
At times, the federal government has been the largest patron of art and architecture in the country. Not just architecture, because 0.5% of all construction funds for federal buildings goes towards art installed at the buildings. And you add that up and it's a lot. So singular buildings
and especially because especially the kind of projects that a young architecture student might imagine one day as their capstone, right? Like that, it's like they're by far the biggest patron. So like the disproportionate set of buildings by which the entire profession defines success, like they are the biggest patron by far.
Sure. And, you know, you go everything from the U.S. Capitol to the state capitol. And then, you know, moving on down the chain, you'll find, you know, historic bank buildings that are also based in temple architecture. There is kind of this, you know, trickle down, but ultimately at the lowest level, you get vernacular architecture. If it's done right, it's still very pleasing. It doesn't have to be, you know, pediments and columns, but you have pleasing historic districts in many places that, you know, were designed via what are called pattern books, which were, you know, books of essentially drawings of parts of a building that could go together. So you take this lintel and that column, and
it was a style guide.
Yeah, it was a style guide, right? And they were very effective. And essentially, those were completely discarded. I mean, it used to be that you could buy a house from the Sears catalog.
Yeah.
And those houses were actually really nice houses.
Yeah.
So, you know, if it's has been done before, I can't see why it can't be done again. And one thing I just do want to say before I forget. So I mentioned Trump's executive order. Unfortunately, Biden rescinded it almost immediately after taking office, as if he had nothing better to do. But it had inflamed all of the right people, all of the right kind of art and architecture elites. I mean, the New York Times ran an editorial titled, "What's so great about fake Roman temples?" But in happy news, there is legislation currently pending in Congress that would essentially codify that order. The lead senator is Marco Rubio, and the lead representative is Jim Banks. So it's great to see that these ideas have spread even farther. Plus, the 2024 GOP platform explicitly commits Republicans to promoting beauty in public buildings and constructing cherished symbols of the nation. And it also calls for making Washington the most beautiful capital city. So again, it started with President Trump, but has really spread from there. And it's my belief that it could even spread to state government.
Mm-hmm. So we might have a regime change here in Washington shortly, kind of like the World War I Memorial, which was obviously tied around the centennial. And then, the other ones you talked about. What's upcoming? Like, what are going to be the bites at the apple that, if there is a different regime in the White House, might be able to add a new crown jewel to American monuments and federal buildings and stuff? I mean, what are you really salivating over the chance to get your teeth in?
Well, there are always more monuments and memorials coming down the pike.
Is there anything that's going to happen for the, I can never say it, sesquicentennial or anything like that?
I like to call it America 250.
Yeah, America 250.
Because people don't, even if you say it properly, people don't know what you're talking about. But so for America 250, it remains to be seen how we're going to celebrate it.
Yeah.
I would love to see
very shortly.
Right. But I don't know how much has been happening regarding it, but I can imagine all sorts of celebration about the great history of classical architecture in America, the government architecture going back to the founders. I could see the creation of beautiful, profound, and moving public art that Americans would appreciate, and instead of, say, art that appeals to certain cultural elites as opposed to the people out as a whole. I do think America 250 could be, is an incredible opportunity to do some big things in this country.
Slight tangent. One of the interesting things that I've come to find out about cars is that part of the reason cars have gotten very boring and conventional looking is because in the same way that nature, I forget the exact term for it, but there appears to be convergent evolution all across nature to what you would recognize as a crab. Like, it doesn't matter. You leave organisms on their own, eventually they will become a crab. And our regulatory regime is basically built such that you can start from whatever starting point you want. Eventually, the nature of most automobile regulations lead to you creating a car that basically looks like a Toyota Corolla. And there's very hard. Is that kind of thing going on at all in terms of like modern building codes and regulations forcing federal architecture or architecture in general in a particularly drab or plain direction?
Well, there are codes out there that affect the design of, say, residential construction when it comes to apartment buildings. Can you put housing over a storefront, or is that illegal? I think there are places where you have to have two stairwells, and that has all sorts of deleterious effects on the design of the building. Regulation can absolutely make things worse, but you can also have positive regulations too. I don't think necessarily that we should have no regulation at all. I mean,
sure.
I mean, you can. In Houston, there's essentially no regulation, and you can have a McDonald's next to a house. I don't know if that's ideal, but there are certain beautiful places with, zoning codes that allow variation within the rules to create very pleasing environments.
So like my pet peeve on this is that like every hotel in America, with the minor exception of the St. Regis line, all look the same and they look like garbage now. Like it's like and this is including in places like New York, where like you walk into a JW Marriott and it looks like a Hilton Inn and Suites basically on the inside, just with like, slightly nicer sheets on it. Like where does that come from? Why?
I mean, some of it could be that they're spending as little money as possible on the architecture. So it's almost just bare construction, just like putting up a barracks. or they think that somehow, having clean lines makes it seem modern, and you're going to find a hotel that doesn't have cockroaches. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just speculating. But, if you look, some of the great buildings in America historically have been hotels.
Yeah, that's why I get so mad
the
about
Waldorf
it.
Astoria, the Plaza,
which we sold off to the Chinese. Do you know about this, by the way?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. The Waldorf has been closed in New York for 3 years because we sold it off to the Chinese and they're turning it into a bunch of apartments.
Yeah. So, this goes back to the green argument.
Yeah.
There's a really great book called How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand. And he talks about how good architecture allows for buildings' uses to change over time. So look at the Trump Hotel. It was originally the old post office. Then it became other government offices, and then it became the Trump Hotel. And I guess it's still a hotel under different ownership. But it shows that the building is well designed and it can be altered and upgraded. By contrast, a lot of modernist architecture is single use. Once you have a steel and glass skyscraper, there's nothing you can do with it. Yeah. It's very hard to convert that into residences. But by contrast, in Wall Street and New York City, certain pre-war offices are now very nice condos.
Yeah. So okay, I've got a donor strategy for you. Go to all of these regional banks that have underwritten vast commercial portfolios and tell them you need to be donating to us so that when your commercial real estate rapidly declines in value, it can actually be converted into apartment stock as opposed to being useless and falling apart right now, which is what's going on. I mean, commercial real estate portfolios in most urban areas are just plummeting in value because of all this stuff. So what in your mind can be feasibly done about all the garbage the left has built over the last 60 years?
Well, obviously we can just build new things around it, to try to make the environment more pleasing, because, few buildings are just standing on their own. They're surrounded by others, and you can build an environment, a more harmonious environment. You can reskin buildings. Sometimes what is happening nowadays is that you'll get some really ugly mid-century skyscraper and they try to reskin it to make it look more modern. Yeah. But it's absolutely possible to reskin certain modernist buildings with masonry. They actually make masonry veneer, which would can vastly improve the look of the building. And I would say in certain cases, it does make sense to tear down the building and replace it with something that, is worthy of our values. Beauty is an important public value. Yeah. And this is the world in which we live. I don't want to be surrounded by ugly, dreary, depressing, or even frightening buildings. Yeah. Sometimes the buildings just have to come down. Yeah.
Is there a resource constraint here? So, it feels like in the historic description of every beautiful building, from the Taj Mahal to, certain American buildings, it's like, this marble was imported from, so-and-so, and, it took 10,000 men to carry each block. Like, are there practical resource constraints for those most beautiful buildings that capture our historical imagination that aren't quite as feasible today?
Well, America still has plenty of stone. I can tell you that. Even though some of the quarries might have closed, the stone is out there. Okay. And also,
were most of the most beautiful American buildings built with American stone?
I think I would say most are. Okay. So, for instance, the National Gallery of Art, the original building is made of Tennessee marble. Okay. And I
didn't know there's Tennessee marble. Good to know.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, if you look carefully, the building's actually pink, not white. And the shades of the stones progressively get lighter as the building goes up. This is the kind of care that architects used to use when designing buildings. And to give you a sense of the modernist position, when that building was constructed, the head of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, the most important school in America, who was a diehard modernist, guy named Joseph Hudnut, he said that building was a pink marble whorehouse. That's the kind of opposition that the classicists
Sorry, what was the building again?
Just to be clear, for those who don't know the building, this is the original National Gallery of Art, which is this beautiful classical design. And so yes, I would say the vast majority of these wonderful buildings are made with American materials, but also in terms of resource constraints or the lack thereof, there's now where there's increasingly new technology to bring down the cost of using stone. So there is CNC machinings. There are these robotic arms that can cut stone. In fact, there's a great, I follow a guy on Twitter named Micah Springnut who has a company with these robots. They can carve anything and can mass produce stone in a way that we've never seen before. And there's also something called panelization, where stone can be done off-site and then brought to the building site. So the idea that these things are cost prohibitive or that we're going to need 10,000 Italian craftsmen with hammers and chisels is just not true.
So getting to the craftsman side of it, I'm in the business of personnel. And so suppose that the edict goes out from the federal government, every new federal building shall be beautiful. Do we have enough high caliber trained architects and all the attendant positions that come with it in order to meet that demand? Or has everyone been trained in how to build garbage for so long that we can't?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for one thing, we're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of buildings. There aren't that many.
But I thought we were going to tear down all the bad ones.
Well, okay. Well, I guess that would be a good problem to have. And who knows, maybe if it was such a huge problem, we can open it up to non-American architects. I mean, Statue of Liberty was not designed by an American, but there are plenty of talented classical architects out there. Many of them working in residential architecture because, rich people, if you give them a choice, very often choose traditional architecture.
Yeah, you and I both spend time in West Palm Beach. That's there's a lot of good stuff.
Exactly. And you have schools like Notre Dame's architecture school teaching classicism at the highest level. Catholic University here in Washington is increasingly teaching classical architecture. And there are some other counterexamples to the general trend of modernism. And I think there's plenty of talent in this country to do all the work that I hope will need to be done.
As the institutional leader within a movement, often a responsibility that falls to people like yourself is to gatekeep and police your own side. What are the bad arguments or some of the bad tendencies in this direction that you've seen that you want to urge people off of so that we don't, go astray in the years to come if we actually make a dent on this?
Well, what I don't want is something that's supposedly traditional, but is, more of the equivalent of Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas.
Cheesecake Factory.
Or like in residential architecture, the equivalent of a McMansion. A McMansion is not traditional architecture.
What are you talking about? There's plenty of columns.
Right. Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas is not classical. Yeah. So yes, I want the public to have a strong say in the styles that are selected. And in fact, the executive order that Trump issued required that there be input from the general public when design decisions were being made. And general public was defined to exclude architects. And I think that would result in the sorts of buildings that Americans like. I don't want, the average Joe on the street designing the building, but it's like going to a tailor, a traditional tailor. You say, I want a suit, and I want it, to look really great. And, if it could be some guy off the street wants, is picking a really loud pink fabric.
Or Jordan Peterson.
And a good tailor will say, well, sir, would you consider the dark blue, worsted? And the tailor is, taking the client's desires into account. Giving him essentially giving the client what he wants, but also making sure that it follows all the right rules and will also look good in 500, 100,000 years. And a talented architect will do that. I mean, I'm not really worried about us ending up with, Caesar's Palace across the land, but that's why we need to have talented classical architects. And we need to have the right people within the federal government to know how to find those architects.
Tell me about Charleston.
Well, Charleston is a historic port city in the South with some of the greatest traditional architecture in the country. These giant houses with beautiful porches. I mean, they're very well designed for the climate. I remember when I first visited Charleston, the historic district is so unified and so old that I almost didn't think I was in America.
Yeah.
It was just stunningly beautiful.
Even though some of the buildings are pink, it feels like it makes sense.
Right. Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not against pink. I mean, a pink suit is one thing, but a pink building in the right place. I mean, I even mentioned the National Gallery of Art as being subtly pink. I don't know if I want loud pink in Washington, D.C., but Charleston is an example of an era in which there was widespread, beautiful building. And, something I didn't say when, I was talking about vernacular building, in other words, ordinary buildings, most buildings throughout history have not been designed by architects. They were designed by what we would call today a contractor. But those contractors were educated in such a way as craftsmen and had access to pattern books, whether written down on the page or in a sense like a pattern book in their head, so that they did a good job. Nowadays, you have contractors who have no idea what they're doing, and you'll end up with, say, something like a McMansion. Yeah,
a division of labor and its consequences, et cetera, et cetera. What role? Because up until very recently, I would say that the cultural valence of a urban historic preservation board is like, oh, these are the worst communists in town. Like, these people don't want anything built. It's terrible. I've been told conflicting things about whether Charleston's a good example of what a historic preservation board can do to actually maintain beauty. How do you think about the kind of micropolitics of that work in American cities and how to think about it?
Well, historic preservation is actually as controlled by modernism as architecture is. Historic preservation ideology requires that new construction, like if you're making an addition to a historic building, has to visibly contrast with the original building.
Really?
That's why, say, you'll go to some beautiful classical museum and the new wing is a glass box. That's actually required sometimes under the law. And it's also what's required by the Secretary of the Interior's Secretary of Interior's standards for historic preservation. It's this idea that we can't have inauthentic buildings. We need people to know whether something is new or old. Like, they don't want to deceive. So, you go to a building and you think that the new wing of the museum is 100 years old when actually the wing was built last year. They think that that's somehow false and we can't have falsity in our architecture. By contrast, in the grand history of architecture, you get additions all the time to longstanding buildings that are harmonious with the original building. I mean, a huge case in point is the Capitol building itself here in Washington.
Yeah, or the White House.
Right. Yeah. Now, if the historic preservationists would have their way if the Capitol building was expanded today, they would say, well, we need to put a glass box on it. We don't want to do anything inauthentic. And so there is that ideology going on in historic preservation. There is also, I think, in terms of this NIMBYism, what you're talking about, where people don't want anything new built in historic locales, the hesitation is based on the fact that so much new architecture is worse than the old. If people were confident that new buildings would be as great as the existing buildings, they would be a lot less likely to be NIMBYs. Like in Charleston, no one's going to object to a new building going up down the street if it's going to be a beautiful building or harmonious building. A lot of historic preservation in the sense of trying to stop construction, I think, is based on this idea that, well, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse. And in fact, in Britain, there's been a political movement led by the Conservative Party to encourage beauty in urban development as a way of encouraging the construction of new housing. They think that a lot of the opposition to new housing is based on people's assumptions, often right, that the housing is going to be ugly, and they don't want that. But if beauty is factored into it, everybody wins. We have more pleasing environments and we have more housing.
2 rapid fire questions. Or 3. Most beautiful city in America.
Well, that's so hard. I mean, you just mentioned...
Come on, this is your day job. You should have an answer to this.
No, I mean, it's like picking which of your children is favorite. I mean, you mentioned Charleston, but in terms of, the most magnificent city, I would absolutely say Washington, D.C.
Okay.
People take Washington for granted. I mean, there are certain capital cities around the world whose names I'm not going to name who are not nearly as nice as Washington. In fact, more modern constructed capitals are often very ugly. Yeah. But we have the founders to thank, and we also have more recent architects to thank, especially the leaders who created the National Mall and Monumental Core as we know it, which really only date back to 1901. Mm-hmm. There was a Senate, the so-called Senate McMillan plan that created the mall to essentially complete L'Enfant's plan for the city. And that's why Washington is one of the world's most beautiful capital cities.
Most beautiful neighborhood in America. Or just something very notable that you feel like, gotta check it out.
Well, I think in terms of gotta check it out, I do love Miami South Beach.
Okay.
Which is, an entire neighborhood of Art Deco buildings, these small boutique hotels. It's like nowhere else I've ever been in America. And it works perfectly in Miami. I mean, I'm a pluralist. What works in Miami is not necessarily what we should build in Maine. That's and Trump's executive order recognizes that there are various kinds of historic architecture all across the country. And you could have Pueblo revival in certain places. You could have Mediterranean revival in others. And South Beach, I think, is just, really, really electric.
Yeah. And then final question, most beautiful building in America.
Oh my gosh. You're right. I'm supposed to have answers.
Or again, like give me the answer like the Miami South Beach one, just like something that people should check out. Really cool.
Well, one building I think that's amazing is the New York Public Library.
Okay.
Which is a Beaux-Arts design. It's classical. The entrance hall is all marble, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And this is a public building. It's a gift to the city. It's every single person can go in there. You could be a world-class scholar. You could be homeless. You could be a man on the street. And it just shows the power of architecture to uplift. I mean, the original Penn Station in New York was this amazing classical design based on the ancient Roman baths of Caracalla. Now, as you may know, the current Penn Station is one of the worst places in America. But the original station was so great that this architectural historian, Vincent Scully, said, one used to enter the city like a god. Now you scuttle in like a rat.
Yeah.
And that's the power of classical architecture. It is tied up with our citizenship. We can feel like equals in a grand space like that that's built for all of us.
It's funny you mentioned the New York Public Library, because what's that old Stalin quote, right? Even the people deserve columns or something. Like there's no reason why we have this. And I think this is where like you could see a really small-minded version of sort of conservative opposition to this kind of stuff in the coming years, where they're like, well, that's more expensive. They could be very penny wise and pound foolish about like what it says about our national spirit by saying there cannot be beautiful public buildings because that would cost 10% more or something like that. Justin, how can people keep up with everything that you're doing? Where can they find your website, your social media? What should they be keeping an eye out for?
So sure. My organization's website is www.civicart.org. We also have a Twitter channel, and I also personally am on Twitter at Justin Shubow. I can't say that I tweet all day.
You lurk.
You
follow a bunch of interesting accounts.
I do lurk. I read a lot. And every now and then I'll comment or post something of interest, a various a lecture that we've hosted or an article that I've written. So yeah, you can check me out there. And I also do have a personal website, shubow.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for everything you do.
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed taping it. It was an absolute blast. When I say that this is like sort of the season finale, we might do another episode depending on, what the heck happens on November 5th. If our headquarters aren't burned down, if the studio isn't burned down, we might want to do a roundup to tell you about, what's going on in the world one way or another. If we'll be having a corner cell in the gulag, that kind of thing. And so that's why I think you'll get more content out of us at the end of the year, but our regularly scheduled programming is coming to a close. close. It just felt sort of silly with vastly more important things happening in the world around us to continue doing the episodes into November. But hopefully you guys will be safe and excited about the things to come. We certainly are. And we are grateful, as always, that you guys have sustained this show, continue to listen to it. Our members, you can sign up to be a member on YouTube and you can be a truther or a statesman there. Be sure to rate and review this podcast, 5 stars only. If you have been listening for 4 straight years and you haven't left a review, I would ask that you acknowledge the sear upon your conscience and solve that and rectify it. It's an embarrassment. You should feel bad. And hey, send some money our way while I'm insulting you at AmericanMoment.org/donate. We really appreciate it. I know for a fact certain of our supporters are listening because they're very interested in this topic. So hi, thank you for keeping the lights on over here. And we will see you guys hopefully very soon with more content, and reach out to American Moment if we can ever help you with anything. Have a great day. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.